Welcome to Cincy Reformed. I'm Pastor Brandon, and I'm with Pastor Zach. We're co-pastors at Westside Reformed Church, a URC congregation in Cincinnati, Ohio. And today we wanted to talk about something that is adiaphora, something that is going to differ depending on your context. And it's the idea of wearing a robe or wearing a collar. There are some traditions within the Protestant world that wear collars. For example, we're pretty accustomed to seeing the Lutherans, for example, wear collars. They wear various robes. In the Reformed world, we have a mix of opinion on whether or not it's helpful for a pastor to wear a robe, or if it's helpful for a pastor to wear a collar. And again, this is going to kind of differ on your context. If you're in Africa, if you're in Florida, if you're in California, you might choose not to wear one, or depending on your context, you might choose to wear a Genevan gown or a collar of some sort. So we wanted to talk about that, and at Westside Reformed Church, we have chosen to wear the robe and the collar, and so we want to talk a little bit about the history behind that, and then also some practical benefits. So Zach, maybe you can start us off with just some of the historical reasons and how these things developed in the Reformed world.
Yeah, sure. There's obviously not a whole lot that's written down about this. Whenever you think about the first-hand accounts of people going to a church service in the 16th, 17th century, in the Reformation, or even before that, you're lucky if you get a bit of a description about what the worship service is like. It's very rare to then get also a first-hand account of what people were wearing. However, with some of the pictures that come down to us, and a little bit of the historical background, we can get a little bit of an idea of what people were wearing and why they might have chosen some different things. But I think it's notable when we think about this from a historical perspective that throughout the history of the church, it's been very common for ministers, pastors to wear something that sets apart their office within the context of holy worship as they lead a worship service. Now, from a Reformed perspective, we do find it to be troubling when a minister begins to look more and more like a priest would look. And so when in 16th century Geneva, when Calvin and the other ministers there adopted the Black Robe, they were adopting some academic attire because they were not comfortable wearing the priestly garments that were common amongst the Roman Catholics at the time. But they needed something also to set apart their office and to look the part of a minister, of a preacher that was leading in holy worship. And they found the academic gown, the black Geneva robe, to be a helpful way to dress for themselves. And then we can understand that after they adopted that attire in the 16th century, they just simply became commonplace and expected that the congregants would see their pastors wearing a black robe. Even if it changed in academia, they began to be accustomed to seeing a black robe in the pulpit. And over the course of time, it became very commonplace, especially in the French Reformed Church. My understanding is that it was even required amongst much of the French Reformed Church. It became common in South Africa, within the Dutch Reformed Church, and other places as well within the continent of Europe to wear a black robe. That was not always the case, however, in other parts of the Reformed and Presbyterian churches, but it certainly took place within some of them. When we think then about the collar, people associate that now with Roman Catholicism, but it's quite interesting that it appears, again, sparse historical records here, that the collar was actually created by a Presbyterian in Scotland, of all places, in order to dress in a way that does not look like a priest. And so it's now some people call it the Roman collar, but it was actually created a while back not to differentiate oneself over against Roman Catholicism. There might be some ways in which it also can be likened to what were called the preaching bands, the bands of Geneva, these collars that came around, and you might see these in some old pictures or paintings of Jonathan Edwards or Charles Hodge, some big white pieces that come around the neck, almost like a necktie or bow tie of sorts, but those were preaching bands to indicate the one who's giving the sermon on the particular Lord's Day. And so there's a little bit of some context there. Like Brandon mentioned, this is adiaphora. It means it's non-essential, that as we think about these kinds of things, we're trying to be helpful. And so from an historical perspective, to wear a robe, to wear a collar, or both, helps to visually place one within some sort of continuity with the history of the Christian church. But Brandon, how about somewhat new for you to begin to wear those now in the last year and a half or so? What are some reasons that you've chosen to do so? Why do you think it might be helpful?
Yeah, so I think, the first time that I attended a service where somebody was in a robe outside of a Roman Catholic setting, I noticed that the pastor was not kind of this big personality. He wasn't trying to come in and command the room, but he was there to preach Christ. And there was in a real sense, you could hear the message without the person and the personality being kind of like the big attention getter in the room. It was the word that was central. And so the pastor then preaching, it's, as John the Baptist said, he must increase and I must decrease. And you got that sense, I think, when the pastor was up there preaching with a robe on. And he wasn't like a trend setter where, if you are in a church where the pastor wears a three-piece suit every day, then you look out in the congregation, everybody's in a three-piece suit. Or if they wear a polo shirt and jeans, you look out, everyone's in a polo shirt and jeans. He's just not a trend setter, but he is somebody there to proclaim Christ, to, in a way, get out of the way and let Christ speak and let Christ minister to his people. So I think in a real way it does that well. Any other reflections practically?
Yeah, I think we see some of this in our day when you go into a court of law. I think it's a helpful analogy to think about a judge wearing a black robe, and that part of the symbolism of the black robe in that courtroom context is that the judge is not speaking on his behalf, but is representing someone or something, in his case, something else, representing the law, and intended to then be someone who is impartial in that way, representing the law in that way, and that becomes a way to think about then, an analogy to help us think about the black robe is the one who's not speaking from his cultural context or cultural background per se, but rather is preaching the word and speaking on behalf of another, on behalf of God, who speaks to us through his holy word. And so I think that representational idea of what a robe can help us to understand is there as well. But how about any other thoughts you might want to share?
Yeah, I think it connects us historically, I think, as well, as as we look back to various Reformed forefathers, going back to Calvin's Geneva. There's a kind of an anti-fad, like there's so many trends and fads in our society where, in the 60s it was bell-bottoms, and then, and so every season, we're tossed to and fro by the fads.
Where I've got skinny jeans.
Yeah, now we have the skinny jeans, and who knows what it'll be next. But the black robe, for example, or the collar, it just transcends all of the kind of the wild seas of fashion, and it connects us, I think, historically, and it transcends culture in that way. And I think it can be helpful.
I think another reflection would be that we have to recognize that there is no biblically prescribed manner of dress, and so anything you do wear is going to have some sort of connotation to it, some sort of a connection, like Brandon mentioned earlier, like a three-piece suit or a jeans and a polo or something like that. There's going to be some way that you are associated with something. And so if you wear a suit, then you could look like a used car salesman or like a businessman from downtown, or if you look, wear a robe, then you have associations there with, I would hope, either not just a judge in a courtroom, but an ecclesiastical sphere also, or the preachers in sneakers kind of a thing right now, the big fad of wearing really expensive shoes and really expensive dress in the megachurch scene. And so all these kinds of things are suggesting something. They're suggesting something to the congregation that's there. It indicates something about how we view worship. Think if someone, especially if someone's wearing very trendy clothes, I think that suggests something about how worship is conducted. Whereas I hope that wearing a robe in our context and a collar in our context is suggestive then of, as Brandon mentioned, the historicity of our faith, that we are recipients of a tradition, that we are transmitting, but also the reverence and the gravity of how we also approach and conduct ourselves in holy worship.
Yeah.
Any other thoughts for you, Brandon?
I don't think so.
All right, well, we hope that's been helpful for you. Again, we're not saying that these things are absolutely necessary by any stretch, but we hope that it's been helpful for you to see why we think it's a helpful practice for us to wear these things. You might disagree, that's fine, but we welcome your questions. We welcome your feedback on these kinds of things. And so this is the Cincy Reformed podcast. Find us at cincyreformed.org. We are sponsored by Westside Reformed Church, which is a URC, United Reformed Church congregation in the west side of Cincinnati. Thanks for joining us. Look forward to the next time. Bye-bye.